morning, survivors. That's pretty cool. We have survivors. That's pretty. Mustn't be Southern California then. Yeah. Anybody live or spend time in Southern California? Try to imagine snow and these rivers of rain that they keep getting. I lived in Monterey for a year. Visited, of course, in the various places. Went to Disney World, Disneyland. Disneyland is in LA. Disney World is in Orlando. Actually, there's Disney Paris. There's one in Hong Kong. Probably 5 or 6 by now, at least. I don't know. Well, good morning, and today we're going to focus on George Barclay, if I'm saying it right, and at least I've got one actor that pronounces it that way too. But it is interesting because there's obviously a university that is named for this philosopher, and I most often hear it pronounced Berkeley.
Yeah.
It's spelled Barclay, right?
It's spelled the same way because it is actually, I've looked it up, it's like confusing because why do they call it Berkeley and he's Barclay? But apparently it's in honor of George Barclay, the philosopher. Although, and this is also confusing, there's associated with the university is Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and that Lawrence Berkeley is a different person and not related to George Barclay.
I feel like they just named the University of Berkeley, and then every time somebody named Berkeley did something good, they're just like, yeah, that's us.
Who knows? But why did they name a university in honor of this guy, who I don't know if any of you had even heard of him prior to this class? Or the question, and I love someone said, where do you come up with these questions? When I asked you the quiz question last class, which was, well, I gave you 2 possibilities, but the one was, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? That was my quiz question for you. And someone over this way said, where do you come up with these questions? Well, that's actually such a famous question. How many of you had heard that question before? Okay, so yeah, it's out there. It's pretty famous. And in fact, I usually respond to you're sending me your thoughts on that by saying that if I didn't ask you that question in your intro to philosophy class, you could probably ask for your money back. I mean, that's such an important, way station. But so I thought, well, I'll answer that person, if that person is not the person who is still in this room from sitting in a different seat. I actually brought a book today. It has pages, it's a physical book. Well, now that's an interesting question with regard to this. Because, well, I'll read the whole section here. So, like Locke before him, Berkeley accepted the empiricist doctrine that all we can know are ideas, and that ideas come from perception or reflection. But Berkeley saw a problem in Locke's assertion of an external world of material substances, giving rise to perceptions. If all we can know are ideas, how can we know there is a world out there giving rise to our ideas? Locke had said that the primary qualities of an external object, such as extension and solidity, are utterly inseparable from the objects themselves, whereas this is not the case with secondary qualities, such as color, taste, etc. But again, asked Berkeley, how can Locke know this? He cannot get outside himself to see which of his perceptions are actually a part of objects out there. Berkeley concluded that Locke's philosophy will lead to skepticism, and in fact it does, actually, whereby he must admit that we cannot really know anything about the world out there. To avoid this skepticism, Berkeley made the radical claim that there is no out there, or more precisely, there is no matter. Berkeley's position, which is called idealism, can be summed up in his famous phrase, esse is percipi. Let me repeat that. Esse is to be in Latin, is the English word is, percipi, to be perceived, or to perceive, right? So esse is percipi, to be is to be perceived. And so that's your phrase from Berkeley, actually. You know, remember, if you're in a cocktail party and someone mentions George Berkeley, yes, esse is percipi, yes, and you're good to go. That should be really funny, but no one's laughing. I don't know why. So esse is percipi. To be is to be perceived. What we call bodies or physical objects are simply stable collections of perceptions to which we give names such as apples, trees, and so on. These collections of perceptions have no existence apart from a perceiving mind. The answer to the famous conundrum, so notice this is even famouser, before Berkeley, right? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? Is that if no one is perceiving it, it not only does not make a sound, the tree does not even exist. I would argue that Locke would say, of course it does, in the common sense. As a lot of people will answer, sound is vibrations in the air, so even if there's no ear hearing it, there will be a sound, from the crash of the tree, right? Berkeley, I would always say, instead of the way this was written by Walter Kaufman many years ago, but he in describing it this way is skipping ahead a little bit, because Berkeley would say, of course it exists, but in the mind of God. In this particular case, he says the tree does not even exist. I would say that would be David Hume. David Hume, which we haven't gotten to yet, but David Hume will criticize Berkeley one step further and take this British empiricist problem of perception to its final skeptical conclusion, right? But does this mean that trees go out of existence when no one is left in the forest to perceive them, and that they come back into existence when someone enters the forest to perceive them again? It would seem that Berkeley must accept this odd conclusion were it not for one important point. God never leaves the forest, and God is always perceiving the trees. By always holding all collections of perceptions in the divine mind, God ensures their continued existence and the perceived regularity in what we call nature. This point has been classically formulated in the following limericks, which you may enjoy. There was a young man who said, God must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Reply, in as deep a voice as I can make it. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. God's voice should be deep, I guess. Could be weak, and that would be funny, though, wouldn't it? I don't know. So Berkeley saw his philosophy as a common sense attack. I won't read the rest, but so what does this mean, idealism? And I've had questions with British philosophers. Did he really mean this? It's only in the mind of God. Or was he talking in the same way that I interpret Leibniz to be talking about? and by the way, there's lots more folks talking about Leibniz this way today, that monads are spirits. In other words, today we would say energy in an arrangement, right? You know, when you get to those, standard model of physics today, we talk of the smallest particles as subatomic. And atomic, we only think of, that's where matter exists at the atomic level, and the subatomic is not matter, right? So matter is made up of nothing, essentially, in the sense of matter. No, it's made up of energy in an arrangement, right? So how do we get understand that perception? One neat way, if I may. No one ever gives me grief for doing this kind of stuff, but
I have a cheesy joke for you about atoms.
go ahead.
Why should you never trust an atom?
Oh, wait a minute, I know the answer to this one. Because they make up everything.
Yep.
Oh, there we go. Okay, it took me a minute, but there you go. They make up everything. Ha, ha, ha. That's a pun. See, because it's two different meanings of make up everything. I'm looking for the, oh, here it is, here it is, here it is.
Think of subatomic particles as some kind of small billions, small grains of sand. But for physicists, a particle has no independent existence. Particle is essentially a set of relations that reach outward to connect with other things.
What are those other things, please?
They are interconnections of yet other things, which also turn out to be interconnections, and so on and so on. You see, in atomic physics, we never end up with any things at all. The essential nature of matter lies not in objects, but in interconnections.
Everybody knows the chord, it's a third, the most basic of harmonies. Carries with it a very distinctive feeling, no? And yet, its individual notes carry none of that feeling. Therefore, the essence of the chord lies in
relationships.
And the relationship between time and pitch
Makes melody.
makes melody. Relationships make music.
Relationships make matter,
Music of the spheres.
as Kepler said.
And Shakespeare before.
So there you go. I like that, the way they explain it. By the way, that movie is based on a book called The Tipping Point by an author who's Friedhof Capra. Friedhof Capra. You've ever heard of him? I should show you. Oops. Here's an F. Capra. He looks like who? So there's, if you're curious about the book. By the way, Friedhof Capra's son was the director of that movie. It's fun. Okay. So Berkeley, let's talk a little bit about his history. We didn't answer the question yet, why are all these universities honoring him in the United States? He was born in Ireland and considered himself Irish, although his parents had been originally British. So if that's an interesting issue, I don't know. Notice they say he's the Bishop of Cloyne. Towards the end of his life he was, and that's his highest rank essentially that's why they stick it there early. He was a friend of Jonathan Swift. So if you're familiar with Gulliver's Travels and other things that Jonathan Swift wrote, Jonathan Swift was a friend of his. And in fact, Jonathan Swift, in order to publish a book, you had to have a noble sponsor you. And Jonathan Swift's sponsor, an earl of some sort, I forget, maybe a duke or other, I don't know. The two of them came to him and asked if George Berkeley could publish his works too, and he was accepted, and so he got to publish under the auspices of the same noble that Jonathan Swift did. So that's kind of interesting, I think, and gives you if you think of Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels as kind of a social critique, that's kind of interesting that way. But so he went on to school. He was very young when he went, and went on to continue to stay and basically teach in Dublin at Trinity College, which is still there, if you're familiar. By the way, if you're ever in Dublin and visit Trinity College, that's where they have the Book of Kells. Have you ever heard of that? The Book of Kells, it's kind of one of the most famous books there is, at least in Ireland. I can show you. I wanted images. We got images. Of course, it looks